Fantastic. Okay. All right. So as I said, there's a new test for contractors that has come into force from February. And today we're going to take a little bit of a look at what that is and how it works. It's actually, there was a lot of talk about it in the media, but it's not quite as it was described. We're going to start by looking at a definition of employee and contractor so that we're all on the same page. Then we're going to take a look at the new test. Now, this is called the gateway test, and it is a gateway through which you travel to become a contractor. And then we're going to take a bit of a look at what's called the common law test. Now, the common law test is the law, and it was already the law before February, but it is worth going over it again because it is a slightly more complicated part of this. And then finally, we're going to take a look at an example about how this might work in real life. One of the real challenges in this area is that employment law is very fact specific. So it really does depend on those sort of specific details of what people are doing in their work. And I will also say that as a general rule, people's work relationships tend towards employment over time because of human nature. So even if somebody was a contractor initially, and we'll look at these different options, over time, they may sort of slide into more of an employment relationship. So it's important to kind of keep this stuff in mind for the whole of that working relationship. All right. So to start off with, we are going to take a little bit of a look at the definitions of employee and contractor, just so that we're all starting from that same page. So you should be able to see on the screen, there are a couple of definitions with some words missing. And all I want you to do is put the words into that definition, and the words are the ones down the bottom here in this little table. So I'll give you a couple of minutes. As I said, pen and paper or a Word document is a helpful thing to have. The reason that I'm making you do this is because that's the best way for you to actually retain the information rather than just having me talk at you for an hour or so. So I will give you a couple of minutes and then we will go through these definitions. So these definitions come from the Employment Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment. And fundamentally, employees and contractors are different things. An employee is a person who works for wages or a salary and has an employment agreement. Okay, so those are kind of fundamental components for employment. By contrast, a contractor works for themselves, send invoices rather than being paid a wage. They don't have an employment agreement. And really importantly, when this comes up as an issue, is in these last two ones, where contractors are not covered by most employment laws and they can't raise personal grievances. So because they're not covered by most employment laws, things like minimum wage and holiday pay and things like that, as well as raising personal grievances if there are issues, unjustifiable dismissal, all of that kind of stuff, that's not available to contractors. And so it's really important that people are aware of which of these two positions they are in. Most often this comes up before the courts where somebody wants to say they are an employee and the person that they are working for says that they are a contractor. Because if they can prove that they are an employee, then they can apply these employment laws to whatever the problem is. If they can't, then there's really no recourse for that person. If something has gone wrong, they just have to accept it. There are some limited civil things where you could go to court, but pretty much nobody does that kind of thing. So this is that's the most likely scenario in which it would come up. Any questions about that definition? Oh, you can put questions in the chat as well at any point and we'll cover them off as we go along. All right, so the government put a new test into place to work out when somebody is a contractor, and this is being driven largely because there was a court case. It went all the way through to the Supreme Court in relation to Uber drivers, where the court found that they were employees, because they met the current common law test. And so then the government changed the law so that they would be considered contractors. But there's a real fine balance between having people be contractors and employees, because if everyone's a contractor, then no one gets employment law protections, which we don't generally want. So the gateway test is the new test that the government have just passed, and it kind of looks like this. So first off, there's that dispute of some kind. Then you have to apply the gateway test. So this is the first test that you apply. This is a checklist. If you meet the gateway test, then you are a contractor. Simple. If you do not meet the gateway test, then you then have to apply the common law test, which was the law before February. So this hasn't gone away, it still exists, and it will still need to be used in quite a lot of cases. Then, depending on the outcome of that common law test, you may still be a contractor or you may be an employee. Okay, so there are now 2 steps that you have to go through to work out when someone is a contractor and when they are an employee. So let's take a look at the gateway test. So as I said, the gateway test is a checklist, and it has a set of criteria, and you must meet all of the criteria in order to be a contractor under this gateway test. So it's the gateway through which you go to check to see if you're a contractor, but it's actually narrower than what like media reporting might have suggested. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some statements, and you're going to work out if these are if these are one of the criteria or if they are not. So if you think it is one of the criteria, again, raise your hand. You can have your cameras on, but you don't have to. You can use the raise hand function, which is at the top of your screen if you would rather do it that way. So let's have a go. First of all, a written agreement that says that they are an independent contractor or not an employee. Hands up if you think this is one of the criteria. Yes, this is one of the criteria. You do have to have that written agreement. What about if you have a reasonable chance to get independent advice before signing the arrangement? Hands up if you think this is one of the criteria. Yep, this one is as well. This one's quite interesting. A reasonable chance, it's not otherwise defined in the Act. It is likely to be a similar kind of reasonable chance as is currently in employment law. So that's about 48 hours to take something away, read over it, and then get back to somebody. It does mean not signing it then and there. If you're signing something then and there, you wouldn't be meeting this criteria of a reasonable chance. What's also quite interesting, it's kind of implied in this, but I can't say with certainty that it will be the case, is that you can't be working for the person with some kind of arrangement already, like before you sign something, because you don't then have that reasonable chance to get independent advice before signing, because you're already doing the work. So it seems that that will not meet the criteria, but it hasn't been tested, so I can't be entirely sure. So you've got to have both of these things: written agreement, independent advice. They have to be able to work for another person, but not at the same time. So you don't have to be able to do it at the same time, but you do have to be able to work for another person. So hands up if you think this is one of the criteria. Yep. Yep. Also one of them. They can choose when to work. Hands up if you think the person has to have the opportunity to choose when they can work in order to be a contractor under the gateway test. Yep. They're hired to complete a specific task. Who thinks this might be one of the criteria? No, this is not one of the criteria. Okay, it doesn't have to be a specific task that somebody is hired for, as long as it meets those other aspects of it. If they can't choose when to work, they can subcontract to a third party, which means that somebody else could do the work for them if they were needed to do it in a specific time or at a specific time or place. And so we think, yep, this is one of the criteria. Yep, this one is. So this one goes along with the choosing when to work. So you either have the opportunity to choose when to work, because that's part of being a contractor. If there's a reason why you might not be able to choose when to work, you could still meet the gateway test, provided that you could employ someone else. You could subcontract someone else to do the work without needing them vetted by the person who you've got the arrangement with. Essentially what this is saying that is if the work is kind of time constrained, then you still have freedom to choose someone else to do it for you. There is a little caveat here. If you need to vet someone for other legal purposes, like because they're working with vulnerable people or something else, something involving the police, I don't know, then you can still do that. That's not what this is saying. This is essentially about saying you don't need the permission of the person you're working for to have a third party come in and do the work for you. All right, they can decline an additional offer of work without the arrangement ending. Hands up, you think, yep, this is one of the criteria. A lot of people are like more reluctant now. Yep, this one is also one of the requirements. And finally, they have to have their own tools, as this one of the requirements of the gateway test. No, you don't have to have your own tools in order to meet the gateway test. Okay, so these are the this is the checklist. You have to meet all of these criteria. Okay, you cannot skip any of them. If you can't meet even one of these, then the person is not a contractor under the gateway test. Now, it doesn't mean they're an employee, because remember, they've still got to go on and do that second test, but they are not a contractor under the gateway test. So, written agreement, a reasonable chance to get independent advice before signing that arrangement. They're allowed to work for somebody else. They can choose when to work, and if they can't make that choice, then they can subcontract that work to somebody else, and they can decline additional offers of work without ending the arrangement. So you have to meet all of those in order to meet that gateway test and be a contractor under this new law. Now, this law came in February, and there are not cases yet. There's one which references it, but only one. So we can't be sure exactly how this criteria will be applied. So on the face of it, it's actually quite tough, right? Like there aren't that many roles in which you could meet this test or check off all of these criteria, where you wouldn't also meet the test probably under the common law one. So it's actually a much narrower gateway than what people might have anticipated this law would be. So, but we do have to wait and see what the courts, how the courts interpret some of these, because there will be some challenges around that side of it. All right, any questions about the gateway test so far? No? Excellent. I've done a good job. If you do have any questions, just feel free to ask. And Millie, I assume you've still got your hand up from the things. You're not asking a question? Okay, cool. All right. So, as we already addressed, that's the gateway test. That's the first test that needs to be applied where there is a question about whether someone's an employee or a contractor. But it is not the only test that needs to be applied. Okay, so for some people, you can go through and tick off all of those criteria, and then they will automatically be contractors because they just meet that checklist. They don't need to worry about anything else. But for many people, they actually won't be able to meet that gateway test. And so then they need to go on and look at it's now called the common law test. So not being able to meet all the criteria does not automatically mean that somebody is an employee, because there's still other things that need to happen. And it's really important, just because I met some of the criteria of the gateway test, that doesn't have any kind of presumption one way or another in terms of whether they are a contractor, because the common law test operates quite differently. So where the gateway test was a checklist, the common law test is a weighing up of the factors of their relationship. So it's about the real nature of the relationship between the parties. And as I said right at the beginning, as a general rule, people's relationships tend towards employment because of human nature. We just kind of like get familiar with people, include them in more stuff. Everything gets a little bit more kind of like regular in terms of how we interact with each other. So even if it was intended that they were a contractor at the beginning, it's about what is actually happening in that relationship now. That's what a court is looking at. And as I said, incredibly fact specific. Employment law is generally very fact specific, and this is the case for the common law test for contractors as well. So as I said, this was already the law before February. So if somebody was in some kind of working arrangement prior to February of this year, then you just apply the common law test to work out whether they were a contractor or an employee. If they were in that relationship before February and it continued after February, then from that date, I think it's the 22nd of February, you can then apply the gateway test and then the common law test. Okay, so it's not a retrospective thing, the gateway test. It only applies to working arrangements from the 22nd of February this year onwards. Even if somebody was in some kind of arrangement prior to that point, it can be applied to them, but only going forwards, only for that chunk of time from February, not for what they're doing prior to that point. So this is the existing law, but it is quite tricky to interpret, and there are a lot of different factors that need to be taken into account with it. So the common law test, as I said, is a weighing up, and the courts have provided 4 tests about how to work this out. They are intention, control, integration, and the fundamental or economic reality test. And what the court is doing is it's looking at a range of different factors across these 4 kinds of areas to try and work out in total whether someone's an employee or a contractor. So you can have some things that point towards being a contractor and then other things that point towards being an employee. The question is which way is more, right? So you've got 1 or 2 things that point towards being a contractor, but everything else points towards being an employee. Then you are more likely to be an employee, and that's what the court will find, and vice versa. So I've got a whole bunch of things up here. What I would like you to do is work out whether these are, so each of these is either more likely to be a contractor or more likely to be an employee. So all I want you to do, again, piece of paper or Word document would be real handy here, is put them down into those 2 categories, employee or contractor. So for example, set hours, which is one of the control questions. If somebody has set hours, they are more likely to be an employee than a contractor because there's that level of control. By contrast, if somebody can control their availability, when they are available for work and when they are not, then they are more likely to be a contractor. Okay, so just with all of these, work out if this is something that is more likely to be an employee or is it more likely to be a contractor. And I'll give you a couple of minutes and then we will come back and kind of make it all fit together, I promise. All right, so these are how they kind of shake down. Generally speaking, because if you think back to that definition of contractors, contractors are in charge of themselves, right? They make their own decisions about what they do, when they do it, who they do it for. That's why they're not employees. And the theory is that contractors could take or leave an arrangement. They don't have to do it. They could find somebody else. So they don't need the protections that employees do. By contrast, employees are largely under the control of somebody else. They are required to be certain places at certain times. They have to do certain things that they are told, and so they should be entitled to more protections in that way. So that's kind of a theory about why these split into these ways. So you are much more likely to be an employee if you meet these set of criteria, and you don't have to meet all of them. Remember, this one isn't a checklist. So for example, if you have an employment agreement, that's a pretty good indication that you are an employee, but it isn't definitive. It does depend on all of these other things that are happening as well. Things like, are you being paid for public holidays? Are you receiving holiday pay? Other kinds of, are you being paid a wage, for example, rather than providing invoices? Things like that. Are you being directly supervised? So is an employer supervising your work, checking to make sure that you are doing what you are supposed to do? Are they giving you direction, telling you what you should and should not be doing and when you should and shouldn't be doing it? Do you have a uniform with a logo? So wearing a uniform isn't definitive. It doesn't mean anything in itself. But if you have to wear a uniform with a logo, then that does suggest that you are an employee, right? Because then you are representing that business. And so there's an expectation that's a kind of level of integration into that business as a whole. Team integration, this might include things like having to attend team meetings, for example. So if somebody has to attend meetings or they have to attend at certain times, or if they're part of a team, a multidisciplinary team, or they're involved in all that kind of stuff, then that points towards being an employee rather than being a contractor. A contractor shouldn't be required to attend kind of internal business things because it's actually not relevant to them. They're not part of that business or organization. That's kind of the thinking there. Be reimbursed for things like travel and expenses. Having set hours where you have to attend, and mainly working for only one entity. Again, it's not exclusive. So you maybe are working for more than one entity, but that doesn't automatically make you a contractor. And it's the same with the ones over here. Really important to note, so the contract for services is an indication that you are a contractor. So if you have a written agreement that says something like you are not an employee or you are an independent contractor, that points towards you being a contractor, but it isn't definitive and it isn't the most important factor either. So even though that's in the gateway test, and you might meet that component of the gateway test, but not some of the other ones, that doesn't mean you are a contractor. What you've signed is only part of what the court has to weigh up. Because if you've signed a contract for service, but you are in fact receiving an hourly wage and you are having to turn up to specific events at specific times and be, directed by somebody, then you are in fact more likely to be an employee no matter what you have signed. So signing something doesn't negate this sort of weighing up exercise. Other factors that point towards somebody being a contractor, control over basically over yourself, control where you work, when you work, where, like what work you do at what point. So it might be that you have an overarching thing to achieve, but that how you get there is up to you. That points towards being a contractor. Having your own equipment rather than having it supplied to you, being paid by results, and then a whole bunch of these kind of economic reality ones that includes things like paying tax. So who is paying the tax? Who is paying the ACC levies? Who is GST registered in this scenario? There's not always, sometimes no one, right? Like sometimes no one is doing any of these things. But if somebody is, then that points towards, if it's you, that points towards you being a contractor. And if it's the person you're working for making those payments, then it points towards you being an employee. But again, not definitive. You can't point to any one of these and say that definitely means that you are a contractor or an employee. and having other employees who can do the work is another component of this. Any questions about the common test or how it interacts with the gateway test? All right, so let's take a look at an example about how this might work in real life. And as I said, employment's very fact specific. So it's all about applying all of these legal sort of tests to people's specific fact or situation that they find themselves in. Now, this is a real example. That is at this point, the only case that has referenced the gateway test at all. But as I said, over time, we are likely to see more cases and get a little bit more clarity about exactly how that is going to be interpreted. So I'm going to show you the example. It's quite long. I'll show you the example, and then I will also put the example text in the chat because I'm going to move the slide on so that we can see the different tests and see if we can apply it to the example. So I'll give you like a couple of minutes to read through with the example. If you are watching this with other people in your office, please feel free to have a discussion amongst yourselves about what you think the outcome of this might be, and then we'll go through those tests in relation to it. Cool. Okay, so we've got a situation. Mr. Zhao has turned up to a work site on the basis of some messages that he and a friend have responded to. And in the course of doing the work that morning, he gets seriously injured. He's so injured, he actually spends 3 months in hospital. So this is a very serious injury. He takes a case to the Employment Relations Authority, arguing that he was an employee and I think he was bringing a personal grievance for unjustified dismissal. I'm not exactly clear on why he is going down that road in relation to this, but that's what he's done. So he's claiming that he is an employee. And there's a whole bunch of information there about how that work arrangement was sorted out. So first of all, we've got this gateway test, right? So you have to meet all of these criteria in order to meet the gateway test and be a contractor. So who thinks that Mr. Zhao has met the gateway test? Okay, so if you don't think he's met the gateway test, why not? Which of the criteria has he not met? Yep, so Tara has said he didn't get a reasonable chance to get independent advice. This is true. He has failed on that one. He has also failed on another one as well. Does anyone want to know, anyone know which one that is? Yep, the very first one. Yep. Okay, so he's failed on both of those first two. He doesn't have a written agreement. He just turns up and starts working. Okay, so there's no written agreement, so he can't be a contractor. And he also fails on that second one because he doesn't have a reasonable chance to get any independent advice because he doesn't get a written agreement in the first place. So he can't meet the gateway test. He is not a contractor under that gateway test. So then we have to go on and work out whether he's a contractor based on the common law test instead. So these are the different things, and you've got to weigh it up, right? It's not quite as straightforward. So again, I'll give you like a little bit of time to kind of have a think about this. There's a whole bunch of information in that example about that might point towards one or the other. And if you think you've got an idea about which one you think he might be, again, feel free to put that in the chat and we'll have a discussion about it. Okay, so Millie thinks he's a contractor. Do you want to explain which of the criteria you think might be pointing in that direction? Cool. Yep. Yeah. So this is a really important point, right? So his choice to work and his control over time. I'd argue actually it's a control over almost all of those. Control over his time. He can choose whether to turn up. He could also choose to just leave at any point, right? There's no relationship there that's requiring him to stay. He has control over his availability, about whether he is available for this work or not. There's no ongoing expectation that he will work for Mr. Liu in any kind of ongoing context. There's also, yeah, control over the, well, maybe not control over the work that he's doing, but certainly the other ones. There is no contract for service. Okay, so this is a good point. You don't have to meet all of these in order to be either a contractor or an employee. You just have to apply all of them to the circumstances. So it is possible for someone to be a contractor without any written agreement at all. It is also possible for you to be an employee in that situation, depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it and all of those kinds of things. So the fact that there's no contract for services points away from him being a contractor, but because there's also no employment agreement, it doesn't necessarily point towards him being an employee. Now, some of the things that might point towards him being an employee is that he is being directed by Mr. Liu in relation to this. He's the one giving them the instructions. But he is also receiving instructions from somebody else. As well as that, where he says that he's going to be paid $24 per hour, that kind of sounds more like wages than it does contracting. However, and I want to be quite clear on this, it's pretty obvious this is illegal work, that he's going to get cash in hand and no one's paying tax at all. So again, that doesn't really make it one or the other, because then it's quite hard to kind of identify whether it would have been wages or if it would have been contracting. Yes, the question here is, if he's injured and he's a contractor, who covers it? So does he need his own insurance, or is he covered by the person who has asked him to work in their insurances? This is a really interesting question, because I'm not exactly sure whether this is what's driving his court case. So he's injured on the job, seriously injured. He's covered by ACC, regardless of whether he's an employee or not. So ACC will have covered his hospital stay for that 3 months. he then actually took almost a year to recover and returned to China afterwards. So this was really significant, like a really serious health issue. It's possible that in order to get some additional benefits, he would have needed to show that employment relationship, and that's why he's taken this court case. I don't think he had insurance, reading between the lines, that would have covered him for this anyway. So yeah, that might be his reasoning for trying to make this case that he's an employee, but it's not the initial cost of the accident. It might be things like lost wages or something of that nature that he would then want to go on and claim. But he's actually raising a personal grievance for being fired without following the proper process. So I'm not quite sure, because that doesn't quite match up with that idea. So yeah. So we're looking at a bunch of these factors. Some of them don't apply, which is quite common, right? Not all of the factors are going to apply to each of the situations. The court makes quite a lot of, they point quite a lot to the fact that there isn't really a relationship between Mr. Zhao and Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu, he doesn't even put the message in WeChat himself. Somebody else does it for him. Mr. Zhao never directly responds to him. It's his friend who does, and then he just kind of tags along. Mr. Liu doesn't know who he is. He doesn't have any contact details for him. He doesn't have any way of providing him with ongoing work or requiring him to work or anything like that. If Mr. Zhao hadn't turned up that morning, there's nothing Mr. Liu could have done about it or would have done about it, because there just wasn't that nature of a relationship. So weighing up all of the factors here, the court found that he was a contractor because of largely that kind of stuff, right? There were no contracts at all. So that doesn't point either way. There was no tax being paid. So again, that doesn't point either way. So you're mostly looking there at integration and control. Mr. Zhao had quite a lot of control. He could have chosen to turn up or not. He could have left at any point without any repercussions. And he wasn't integrated in any way into Mr. Liu's own business because, again, he just turned up on the day. So, yep, we are pretty much at the end. If you can wait, I will. Hang on a second. Yeah, so that's kind of how that one went. It's important to remember that you can still be found a contractor, even if you don't meet the gateway test. I'm just going to launch a couple of polls. If you could complete these before you go, that would be very helpful. If you can't see the polls, I will put the questions in the chat as well. Hopefully you can see those polls. Yeah, so yeah, cool. So I've got the polls there. As I said, this is the only case so far that has covered off both the gateway test and the common law test, but the common law test is fairly well established, and there are a whole bunch of things in relation to that. All right, and finally, if you just want to type one thing that you've learned so far and then post that in the chat. And if you've got any other questions, I'm happy to hang around for a little while to answer any of those as well. And finally, Taranaki Community Law, we don't offer services for employers, but we can help people who think they might be contractors or are unsure about whether they are contractors or employees. We just can't work for employers. So if you can't see the polls, the questions are, hang on a second. So feel free to just answer those if you would like. And as I said, if you've got any questions, I will be hanging around for a little while. So if you've got anything to ask, just feel free.